and welcome to part 2 of Nancy Tucker's series on postcard producers of Albuquerque. One of my main supports in learning and doing this role has been Nancy Tucker, who just brings in the most amazing stuff. And like once a month I will get this email and I've got stuff. Do you have time? And postcards, brochures, single-issue magazines, mostly electronic zines. If it's out there, Nancy can find it, and she will share it. And I have learned an awful lot about this city and doing the job just by looking at Navajo Trucking Company had playing card promotion, and she found one of those cards, and it's like, Navajo Trucking Company? Oh, where the museum was, the cascade of things. Nancy's particular passion is postcards, and combining her passion for Albuquerque's history with her passion for postcards brings a really unique, very visually stunning and fascinating perspective on the history of the city. So I am going to turn off my mic, turn on Nancy's, and get out of the way. Thank you so much for coming.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I hope you enjoyed the pre-show. I've got so many postcards that I like to show them off to people who are interested. That I conceived this idea of having a pre-show interspersed with jokes that are relevant. All of the cards that you saw in the pre-show were Albuquerque postcards. And I drew the photographer-oriented jokes this time from Albuquerque newspapers, either direct quotes from our local newspapers or quotes from other newspapers, because photography was a huge thing at the turn of the 20th century. I have interpreted the Golden Age of Postcards very liberally. It actually sort of peaked around 1907 to 1909, but I just decided to do the first 2 decades because there are a lot of changes that happen in the photography business. Most of the postcards that you saw were what we call real photo postcards, RPPCs, which are an actual photograph put on usually Kodak paper, or at least Kodak originally. They are as genuine a photograph as the kind of things that you probably got unlabeled in boxes in your homes. From a photograph, you could make a printed card, and you know the difference between, because you can see all these little ink dots on the printed cards. Most of the cards that you will see today are going to be real photo cards. Amateur photography took off in 1900 when the Kodak company introduced the Brownie camera, named after a popular cartoon character, one of these little brownies. It was basically a box, and it was point and shoot before there was point and shoot time. It was so easy to do, even a woman could do it. And they did a lot of advertising about the brownie box. There's another one there, and one of the brownies. I'll bet a lot of you had one of these.
Yes.
I asked that question yesterday to a mixed age audience, and everybody over the age of about 60 knew what this was, and those under 60 had no idea what this was, although maybe they had heard of it once. And they went beyond the box to this folding camera that you could actually put in your pocket. And this just exploded things. Here we have a couple of ladies taking a seaside picture with one of these cameras. It turned everybody into a photographer, very much like what people do with their cell phones now. They just took pictures and pictures and pictures and pictures. And you could even sell your pictures if you were smart. 5 cents a piece for the photo postcards. Yeah, I suppose you could get that if you had something really good. In here, the Albuquerque Citizen is advertising that you can make all of your vacation money at 5 cents a piece selling photo postcards. Okay, I'm going to talk about a series of individuals and companies, people who were photographers in Albuquerque. Some of them were professionals, some of them were non-professionals. We don't know about some of these people. But I've dug down to do some research, and I put it more or less in chronological order here. So the first are the Cobbs, probably the first family of Albuquerque photography. Will Cobb, Eddie Ross Cobb, Daphne, and Edmund as a boy. Very long time they operated. As usually they call the company the Cobbs. That's how they signed their postcards. Here's the earliest Cobb postcard that I can find. It's pre-March of 1907. I know that it's March of 1907 because the back of it does not have a line separating the address side and the message side. You had to write the message on the front, which is why you find a lot of old postcards with a lot of white space on the front. That's where you were supposed to write the message until the post office discovered that Americans were smart enough to be able to write on the back along with the address. These are later postcards done by the Cobbs. Wilfred was involved in the company. These both probably date from the 30s, where he's drawing on the company's extensive archives of old photographs, showing you that maybe it would behoove you to update your professional profile. Here in the 30s, they did these kinds of cards. Cobb cards are very scarce. I'm showing you just about everything that I know of. But you can see from this lighting in this real photo card or this printed card why Albuquerque was known as the Neon City before Las Vegas, Nevada. I mean, you'd come out of the dark of Tejeras Canyon or from the west, and you would see this blazing neon. It was very, very impressive. They also went out to Madrid and photographed those big Christmas displays that Madrid had every year. Madrid was so lit up that I have read that airplanes would divert their flights over Madrid in order to see the colorful lights at Christmas time. And the Cobbs went out and they took large format photographs, and they also took a few postcards. These are all real photo postcards. This one I would kill for this particular postcard because it's written by Mrs. Cobb in 1909. Wow. I'm going to let you read the caption there, what she wrote. It's all of what she wrote here. They talk about going out Kodaking. You notice the small K. But that's what they called it at that point. Kodak was like the word Kleenex. It became a generic word. It became went from being a noun to a verb.
My grandmother had a Kodak.
Right.
She didn't have a camera. She had a Kodak.
Right, you have a Kodak. You go out Kodaking. You see that on postcards a lot. This is probably the sandhills east of downtown.
Yeah, Martinez County area.
Next person is Milton Edson Porter, who happens to be my personal favorite. I talked about him in my last talk, so I'm not going to go extensively into it. He came here originally to work at a correspondence school and to deal with his spinal tuberculosis. Yeah, very painful. He worked at the correspondence school. He was a kind of a traveling salesman for it, and that became very painful for him, so he ended up working for a couple of photo processors here in town, and then eventually set up his own studio. He did beautiful postcards. They are absolutely my favorite cards. Printed by the Rotograph Company in their Germany offices. You send the film to Brooklyn, And then they would send it to Germany, which at that time had the best printers in the world. And then the postcards would come back to you in a period of a couple of months, and you would sell them for a penny or 2 pennies. I mean, international commerce on a massive scale. American printers were so upset about this that they convinced the federal government to impose tariffs on these imported postcards. He also did what they called Indian pictures at the time, or Indian views. This is the back of one of their business card, photographed business cards. Porter was known for being very friendly with the Isleta and other pueblos. And you can see that this lady is pretty relaxed. This one is not happy about having her picture taken. But this lady is pretty relaxed, and a lot of when Porter died, a lot of pueblos showed up for his funeral. They didn't go inside the church at that time, but they stayed outside. They liked him so much. Okay, Ewing and Hilton. You know, I looked on and off for years for any information about Mr. Ewing and Mr. Hilton. I don't even know for sure that these are their correct names, but I have a theory. First of all, they don't seem to have had a studio as such. It doesn't appear in any city directories. There is no Hilton and Ewing studio or Ewing and Hilton studio. But I did some tracking through the library here and through Ancestry.com and old copies of the census. And I discovered that Mr. Ewing and Mr. Hilton were next door neighbors here in Albuquerque. And they both came from Indiana. And my hunch is that they got to talking like Indiana people do. Well, I can say that because my father was from Indiana. And discovered a mutual interest in photography. Ewing, at one point, worked for one of the photo processing companies here in town, Houston's. He shows up in 1905, leaving the Houston store, having locked up at night, and then the store was broken into by a robber. And we get a story in one of the local papers about this robbery. But that's how I figured out that Ewing was involved in photography. And then I found out that they were next door neighbors. And this is my tentative conclusion anyway. Now, these 3 photos are all of the same event, which is the lighting up of the Alvarado Hotel at the 1908 International Irrigation Congress. They put, it says 3,900 incandescent lights. Notice that the photo by Ewing, or here it's Ewing and Hilton a couple of times. I think that Ewing was the photographer and Hilton, who was the younger man, was the salesman. Went around to various shops in town selling these postcards. Perhaps stood on the platform at the train station selling postcards. But they lasted for several years. This is a 1911 event where the Santa Fe Railroad sent around these huge trains for people to look at. And this was a firemen's union meeting in May of 1911. But people flocked to see these big old trains. They were pretty amazing.
There's a 4,000.
What's that?
Oh, I was talking about the lower engine.
Oh, yes. The Firemen's Union meeting and the Santa Fe demonstration train, both at the same time. Here's another photo by Ewing and Hilton. This is probably the parade having to do with the 1908 Irrigation Congress. This is the laying of the cornerstone at the Masonic Temple. That happened in 1910. And then here's Hadley Science Hall at UNM, erected 1889, burned 1910. This has been tinted a little bit, you can see. So they were out there photographing events and selling cards of the events. And you know, you have a young man running around, youngish men running around taking these pictures that maybe you, as an upstanding lady, could not, climb up on a construction platform to get a photograph like this and send it. They also went into, and these are far more frequently seen, printed postcards. And these are my least favorite Albuquerque cards, because they're pretty, what I would call muddy printing. It's not very distinct. It's clear, though, that they figured out a way to take one image and use it and reuse it. This is probably the first of them, because they forgot to put a caption on it. Then they put a caption having to do with the Irrigation Congress. Then here's the Irrigation Congress caption, but in a different color. And then after the Irrigation Congress was over, they took off the Irrigation Congress and just made it a photograph postcard of the armory here in town, and they could sell that for years and years and years. That armory lasted so long, Elvis Presley did a concert in it. They also did Indian views, and they did some fairly nice ones, I think. This is the famous L of Ganado, Navajo weaver. The Fred Harvey Company had what they called a demonstration room at the Alvarado complex, where Navajo women and Navajo little girls would weave and talk to the tourists if they spoke any English. The Ewing and Hilton probably went out again to Isleta or some such place. This is one of those little little Navajo girls. They also did something very interesting and very uncharacteristic of the time. They actually labeled these with people's individual names, or at least their Anglo names. It was not uncommon at the time to take a picture of a famous Indian person, like El of Ganado. The Harvey Company would have her picture on the postcards, and they would say, "The most famous weaver of the Navajos," and not give her name. But here we know this is Mary James, a Navajo weaver. We know that this is Jim James, Navajo Indian building. And so that's quite unusual for the time. But again, these postcards are kind of muddy. They were probably printed locally. And you can really see the quality difference between these and the quality, the high quality that was done in Milton Porter's cards. Karl Moon. Now, Karl Moon became a rather famous photographer. He was almost as good as Curtis. Hold on a second. Edward S. Curtis. Moon didn't last very long here in Albuquerque. As you can see, he only set up for about 2 years. He had the Moon studio and the Moon and Kelleher studio, with Kelleher doing the business part and Moon doing the photography. But he did magnificent work. Really magnificent photo work. A few of the cards, copyright by Karl Moon, but Moon did a lot of work for the Fred Harvey Company, and these are Indian building cards that were sold at the Alvarado and at the Indian building. Again, the little Navajo weaver girls. But his photography is magnificent. This one you still see. This is the postcard version of it with the copyright Karl Moon on it. And this is the kind of inner frame of a framed version of this young man. Just very intense, gorgeous photography. And signed here. You can have this on eBay for several $100s. Let me go back for a second. After Moon had been here for a couple of years and had done some cards for the Harvey Company, he came to the attention of people back east with some of his photo exhibits, and he came to the attention of the Harvey Company, who wooed him away from Albuquerque. He was invited to become the head of their art department He was given an apartment and studio at El Tovar at the Grand Canyon, and he stayed there for 7 years. He probably had enough of Albuquerque anyway. His first wife died while he was here, and he left at the time after she died. He met his second wife there at El Tovar in the Grand Canyon. That was Grace. And after 7 years of hanging out at the Grand Canyon, they moved to Pasadena, where he had the conclusion of his career. He didn't do much anymore in the way of Indian photography, which is a terrible shame, although he photographed something like 27 different tribes. He got into illustrating his wife's books, and having met a number of painters in his time at the Grand Canyon, he got into painting. And if I had known him then, I would have said, Karl, stick to the camera. Because his paintings are artful but awkward, I think. He didn't have a great signature, though. But this is a painting from his years, many years in Pasadena. Now, this card I found in my collection. At first, I did not know what I had, but this is a burned leather postcard by none other than Karl E himself. He says in the message here, I burned about 30 of these all evening. What they would do is they would take something that was sort of like a hot needle. Maybe some of you did this in the 50s. I know I did, called pyrography. Burning wood or burning leather with a hot instrument. And he does this delightful little burrow here and sends off the card to his niece in Ohio. With love from Uncle Karl, and K-A-R-L. Now, if you're familiar with Moon, you know that there are two spellings of his name, K-A-R-L, which is the name that he was given at birth, and C-A-R-L, which is the name that he chose in about 1918. Now, why did he do this? Because of the First World War. There was a lot of anti-German sentiment, and so he thought that the K-A-R-L was a little bit too Germanic, and he changed the spelling to something a little more English. Okay, now speaking of English, we have William R. Walton. He and his family immigrated from England to Rhode Island. And he set up there, traveled around an awful lot, Karl did. He spent a number of years, Will Walton rather, he spent a number of years in Colorado Springs and then migrated into New Mexico in about 1900. Went to various locations, settled in Roswell in 1903, bought into a studio there, and then in 1907 he went down to Chihuahua, Mexico for a while, and then turned up in Albuquerque about 1908 and set up a rather long-lived studio. He bought what was the Karl Moon studio. One of the things that I thought about doing, and then I thought, oh God, it's going to be, just too much information, is making charts showing the studio started with this guy, and then it was sold to this guy, and then it was sold to this guy. You will see that Walton bought the Moon studio, Walton sold his studio to somebody else I'm going to be talking about, and he kind of goes on and on and on and on. Yes, in generations. But this photograph, I think, is Walton. He was the official photographer for the Irrigation Congress in 1908. And in this much larger photograph, there are a bunch of rather disreputable young men, another of which has a cap on, and is identifiable as a photographer from El Paso. because they actually produced daily newspapers at the Irrigation Congress as a demonstration project. The Irrigation Congress was a once-a-year international meeting of people interested in bringing life to the desert. And here's Will Walton. These are a couple of his cards. Some of them are, this one is a bit stiff, this one is very nice. But you notice he was very careful to put his copyright. Most of them did not do that kind of thing. They didn't think their work was terribly important. After all, it was just postcards. But Walton was very careful about putting his copyright on almost everything. He got a lot of praise for a photograph of our three little volcanoes. He took a large format photograph, hand-colored it, put it in the window of his shop, and everybody admired it. So he thought, oh, everybody likes this. I think I will make a bunch of postcards. And you see the same image 1, 2, 3 different times, done in different colorways. If you look very carefully, you see that's the same cloud pattern here. These are the 2 earlier cards, and then this is a later one with that white border. And then this is a different view, not too different, but a slightly different view. Could be even the same view cropped differently. But he got a lot of mileage out of this. Okay, another studio called the Fights Electrical Studio. It meant that they had electricity in their studio, and they used electricity to process photos. This fellow was, he would bear investigation. He was quite a self-promoter, came to Albuquerque, Sam Fights. This is the local guy who worked at a bank and provided the business sense. Sam Fights found he could persuade gullible newspaper reporters to write that he was the taker of images of the crowned heads of Europe. And that is a quote. He claimed to be friends with a lot of people in the theater industry, and he was able to verify this claim of knowing a lot of theater people by the fact that he had dinner with a traveling actor. He was a real promoter. Got himself a job. Here again we go back to 1908, and the town was ablaze in 08. Somebody really ought to do a book about the effects of the Irrigation Congress. Weinman and Lewinson Dry Goods Store, also known as The Economist, hired Fights to take a series of photographs, make them into postcards, and then distribute them for free to people who were in town for the Irrigation Congress, which ran at the same time as the Territorial Fair and Industrial Exposition. It was a huge deal. The town swelled to 40,000 population. It was very big. The Santa Fe Railroad pulled in Pullman cars and had people sleeping in the Pullman cars because the hotels were full. It was a huge deal. The Economist handed these out, made newspaper advertisements saying that they had free postcards. Well, that was a big deal then. People collected them. And so we have this series, 4 of which are inside interior photos, which were unusual at the time because it required some good lighting. So you have to give Sam Fights credit for having done these interiors. Interior postcards are a whole collecting category of their own. People really like them. But the shadiness of Fights is evident in the fact that he was accused of buying a camera lens, variously priced all the way up to $300, which was an astronomical amount of money in those days. The camera lens happened to have been stolen from Milton Porter. Remember him? And Porter was able to identify the lens by serial numbers on the lens, and it was found in the possession of Feitz. Well, it turns out that a young man who had been in the employ of Porter apparently stole the lens and sold it to Feitz. And Feitz said, "Oh, I bought this from some shop back east. Oh, I bought this from some native, quote, native on Central Avenue." He had lots of excuses, but nevertheless, he was in possession of stolen property. They hauled him up to court and they sent him to the territorial prison for a year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, justice was a little different back then. And that was the end of Sam Feitz, which is a shame because he was obviously a talented photographer. He also was an artist. He illustrated a number of Albuquerque booster booklets. I'm not going to show you some of the art from those, but he did a very good job, and it's really a shame that he trafficked in crime. Okay, Ira P. Bacon. Don't know much about Mr. Bacon. He was a printer at the Albuquerque Journal. And he did one postcard that I have been able to find. It's labeled Bacon there. It says Armory and Gym, Albuquerque NM. I would say that he was an amateur. Perhaps he had ambitions to become a professional because he actually did sign the card. And he did think to caption the card, which a lot of people didn't think to do. This is the guy who wrote this message here. Here's the little boy. And since he's wearing an overcoat, it's probably the winter after the Irrigation Congress. And there's that armory and gymnasium. They turned it into a gym. They made good use of the building. So that's Mr. Ira Bacon, about whom we don't know very much. And I can't even say for sure it was Ira Bacon, but he is the only person that appears in the city directory named Bacon. Schutt and Wright. This is again questionable. I haven't been able to find out if this is the correct Schutt. If it is, this guy was a confectioner here in town. He made candy. Charles Wright you probably know because of Wright's Indian building. Remember that beautiful building that he built a little bit later on. And Wright's is one of the oldest businesses in town. They still have their Indian trading post at Louisiana near Manal. Now, Mr. Wright was a big deal in the Shriners. And the Shriners used to dress up as Indians and go to shrine conventions. Notice they were too modest to have bare chests. Or perhaps this was getting on to fall and winter. So they wore red face. They wore approximations of Pueblo dress. They had a real Pueblo man as their drummer. I think this is a man dressed up as a woman. And there they are, the Balat Abyad Temple, Indian Patrol of the Ancient Arabic Order Nobles of the Mystic Shrine. And that's what it says down here. Noble C.A. Wright, Chief. And this is copyrighted by S&W, which I know from other postcards is Schutt and Wright. Notice how new those blankets look. Here's a guy, I think it's a guy, dressed up holding a very Anglo child. There's that drummer in the background. But here they are on parade. They are in these photographs practicing for a performance that they will give at the Shrine Convention in Los Angeles a little bit later this year. The people performing as women in here even have the tabletas on their heads. I don't know how they got local Pueblo people to instruct them in some of this stuff. It's pretty outrageous. But it wasn't uncommon. You find even in the 50s, a group of women locally who were known as the Navajo Drill Team. And they would wear velvet blouses, Navajo skirts. They would have a headband around here with a single feather up here, and they would do a drill team routine at their fraternal order. So it was something that lasted for a long time, Anglos dressing up as Native people. There are a whole series of these postcards. I've only showed you a few. Now, another outfit here in town was called the Postcard Studio. Here's another colorful character, Joseph Knorr. He was active in Albuquerque only a couple of years. He came here from Pennsylvania after having been convicted and doing time in the workhouse for things like receiving stolen goods, larceny, and forging checks for the bank that he worked for. He arrived in Albuquerque in about 1911, went to work for the Santa Fe Railroad as a switchman, and then had an accident for which he sued the Santa Fe Railroad for $20,000. Accident, I'm putting accident in quotes, you notice. We don't know that it really was an accident. The thing actually went to trial down in El Paso, and he was awarded $900. He seems to be something of a con man, but he lasted for a couple of years here in Albuquerque with this photo studio, which was kitted out with all kinds of props. He advertised that he had an airplane that you could sit in his studio. I have yet to find a postcard of the airplane, but here are three, and these are unlabeled cards. In other cities, you would see on the back, it would say Postcard Studio with his address, but here in Albuquerque, the only way you know it's Albuquerque is by this pennant there. I like this one particularly because it shows a Hispanic man and an Anglo man together. He also had a car, and you know it's the same car because there's the same box. 3 different times, there's the pennant again. So you would get your family group or your couple of your pals and go and have 5-cent postcards made and send them out to your family to say, hey, I live, look how sophisticated we are here in the West. Okay, now we're going to get back to a more conventional company, Hanna and Hanna. I'll bet there are people here who did business with Hanna and Hanna because they were in business a long time. This very poor newspaper photograph is from their first year in business here in Albuquerque. This is Otelia Hanna, born in Russia, speaker of 6 languages when she arrived in Albuquerque, picked up Spanish as her 7th. And this is Mrs. Hanna in later years. This is son Bud Hanna, who was the 2nd generation and carried the company up into the 80s. And this is Milton Hanna. My hunch is that Otelia was the driving force in this family business. In 1919, they bought another studio in town, and the newspaper reports that Mrs. Hanna concluded the deal. Here she is on the phone too, being active. So I think that she was it. Although she only had an 8th grade education, and her husband only had a 10th grade education. That was not unusual back in those days. But she was active in the Business and Professional Women's Association in Zonta, which is a women's fraternal organization. She was involved in, let's see, what else? The Emblem Club, Cerebral Palsy, Eastern Star. He was a member of the Elks, the Masons, the Albuquerque Little Theater, the Art League's Camera Club, and he did some real estate work. So they did very well on their limited education. She was only 20 when they moved here, and he was 24. They were prolific advertisers. They advertised themselves almost from the beginning as Hanna and Hanna master photographers. And they were very careful to label their postcards. A lot of the early ones you see what we call blind stamping in the corner, Hanna and Hanna Albuquerque. This particular event, and they did a lot of documentary photography as well as portrait work and commercial work. They did a lot of going out to events here in Albuquerque, making a bunch of postcards and selling them. Here we have the arrival in 1919 of the King of Belgium, who after the First World War did a tour of the United States to thank Americans for saving his country during the war. He's arriving here at the Alvarado. He's on the Alvarado grounds. He and a whole bunch of people went down to Isleta, watched some dances, had lots of postcards, photographs made of those events. In 1932, the Hannas did a whole series. This is the churches at Isleta. This is the relatively new VA hospital. This is the trolley coming down Central Avenue, probably near the park, 12.
It's across the street. That's Edith is just at the foreground, and Walter is where that tall building is.
Oh wow! Okay, did you hear that? This is across the street. Edith is in the foreground. Walter is right in here, Joe.
Those facades are still there.
Okay.
Those
little. Oh, okay. The little ones right across the street. There's what it used to look like. Okay.
The Occidental Insurance is the office in the back of 6th.
Oh, in the far.
I love having history people here.
I've never seen that one.
Yeah, it's a very rare card. It's the only one I've ever seen. They did commercial work, as I said. Here's that Wright's Trading Post, the Indian building. They have an Orno right here. McKinley Land and Lumber. The Super Service Station at 401 North 4th Street.
Oh my.
And here's another documentary thing. There was a coast-to-coast biplane race in 1932. They went out to the field and took these pictures. How do you want to race and help bring a plane to a halt? I think that would be rather dangerous. But there's a whole series of these cards showing these guys with the planes. Milner Studio. Alabama Milner, another person with a very long career. You notice there seems to be a theme here, that the companies with the women involved, the Cobbs, the Milners, and Hanna and Hanna were very long-lived companies. I'll leave it to you to decide why that is, but they were. Alabama Milner did wonderful, wonderful photographs, commercial portrait work, but she did one postcard that I've been able to find, and this was probably at the end of the career. This says on the back, the Milner Studio. I have yet to find another Milner card. I wish she did more because they would be very, very interesting. But, postcards were not a huge profit generator for her or for anybody else. The Barnum Studio, Savedra Barnum. This is a studio that was bought by Hanna and Hanna. I have found one card from them And it's blind stamped here, the Barnum Studio, Albuquerque, NM. Nice portrait work. One of the things you find in other cities is a lot of these portrait postcards. Albuquerque has very few. There's the postcard studio and Barnum and not much else. Now, there were a lot of photographers in this city. These are 61 that I have counted between 1900 and 1920 that did not do postcards that I know of. That's in addition to the ones you've already seen. Now, the ones in red are Hispanic names. The ones in yellow are the women. Look how many more women there were. I mean, we know about the big three. Eddie Ross, Cobb, and Mrs. Albright, and Alabama Milner. But there's Mrs. Albright. Ida Millett, Navy Pearson, and that was her name, Navy, that is not a misprint. Miss Florence Potter of the Potter Sisters, and Mrs. Clara Starr, who comes to the fore because of a lawsuit that she gets involved with. So, Mo Palmer, who does a very nice presentation on the big three women photographers, can add these additional ones to her list. But these are a lot of people who may have done postcards, but we don't know, because they're not always something. So, I've got some mysteries for you. See if we can identify some of these. This is mystery number 1.
Rosenwald.
This is Rosenwald's, right.
That's the commercial.
This is the commercial club down there. Yeah, I used to call this the photographer of the spiky writing. Very distinctive captioning sign. And for a long time I thought this company was an Albuquerque company. I was very frustrated that I couldn't find out who did this. These are 2 more by that same spiky writing. This is the Women's Club building. It's the only photograph I've ever seen.
The Women's Club.
Postcard. The Women's Club building.
Where was that at? Where was that?
I don't know.
The 1907 sundial.
Uh-huh.
That was a horizontal sundial with the pointer sticking straight out. So you read it, and it was stolen. It was in from Hodgson Hall. They had disassembled it completely and reoriented it not to face south. It's now the corner there of the old library building, which is the Art Annex. Terrible job of what they did here.
Yeah.
It was given by the class of 1907.
My goodness.
So this is spiky writing again. Here's some more spiky writing. Here's the Masonic building, probably about 1911. All of the postcards that I have by this spiky writing company are postmarked 1911, which is unusual. Usually you find a range, but they were all done at the same time.
That astute was a copy of the Kiva at San Domingo. President Zimmerman was made president standing on those steps. And had representatives of the Pueblos. Tite built that. Christie refused to go in it. Tite was the president, Christie was the architect. Refused to go in it. It's now the Pikes, I think. But it was originally the Yum Yum Boys.
Yum Yum.
And they were called that because they stole people's lunches. University being outside of town. And the boys went to San Domingo and removed various objects from its original, from San Domingo, religious. And there was almost the second Pueblo uprising.
Yeah, I can imagine stealing from somebody's kiva. Yeah, that'll do it for you.
And it's not true that a woman has never been in it.
Do we have a date on that, though?
About 1914.
On a woman first being in it?
In 1907, 08 on that.
Okay.
but I think a woman was in it in 1914.
Well, I discovered this spiky writing company did cards of places other than Albuquerque. Here's one from Raton with the wonderful witch's hat feature at their train station. This is the Harvey House and Depot with Winslow. So I thought, wait a minute, both of these are on the train line. Does that mean that the photographer who did these possibly was just taking a train trip around? So I started looking for more of these postcards, and I found a couple that had captions on them. This one is from a Raton card signed Doubleday-Patton, and this one is Doubleday Huther from a card from Agua Prieta in Mexico. So I started thinking about Doubleday. Doubleday is a name known to postcard aficionados as R.R. Doubleday, who was a fellow who for some 40 years traveled around America going to rodeos, taking pictures of rodeo acts and captioning them. And if you look real carefully, one of the things that's unusual about this is the U's are very squared off. And the T's, you can't really see it very well here, have, in addition to the cross part of the T, they have a downstroke on the T. Well, Mr. Doubleday's printing of his own name has that squared off U, but his captions do not have the downward strokes on the T. So this is just, I'm thinking about it. I don't know for sure that these cards are by Doubleday, but he traveled for 40 years doing postcards of rodeos. And it may be that in his travels, you know, he'd hit a town, he'd make a bunch of postcards, he'd sell them, and then he'd go to the next town, make a bunch of postcards, and sell them, because he had a traveling photography outfit. You're seeing here my thinking process on all of this, because all of those Albuquerque cards were postmarked 1911. 1 year, one single year. It's as though he came through, did a blast up, and went on someplace else. So it's a hypothesis at this point. Okay, here's another company, or individual. They used this kind of captioning. Clearly a type captioning. Very cleverly, they put it in the dark part here. You see that? This is this right here. Unusual to have a photograph of the Sandia Mountains. You know, it's a big thing to get clearly, and they did a pretty good job with it.
That text looks like Malarkey's photo of Gallup using that.
But Malarkey was much later than this. Yeah, but that's a good thought. Thank you, Joe. This Hogan here was catty corner to the Alvarado complex. Right, and there was also a little tiny pueblo of a couple of rooms here, catty corner, and the demonstrators, El Ganado, this was her home. And the Pueblo people lived in, it might be this building here, although I don't think so, in the little Pueblo. So in addition to getting off your train and having a bite to eat and running around finding postcards and everything, if you had the time, you could go across the street and look at how the natives lived. You can see there are two Navajo people standing by the door there. Okay, mystery number 3. Who did these? Look at that fancy writing there. That's hard to do backwards, which is what you have to do if you're writing a caption in the negative.
Oh my.
There's Albuquerque High School. That was pretty new. This says, piles driven for breakwater West End Alameda Bridge, January 1915. One of the really nifty things about postcards is that you sometimes find on postcards documentary evidence of things that don't appear anyplace else, because people were out shooting this stuff everywhere. So postcards really are important historical documents. This is apparently the same photographer, same captioning. These are 3 views at the Indian building. This is Elle herself. These young men are Western Union delivery boys. They look so cute in their short pants there. And this says Indian squaw and papoose. All of these are from 1912. So the person who did this in 1915 apparently also did these in 1912. Okay, mystery number 4. One postcard with this very neat captioning right there. This is the Hotel Combs downtown. I have no idea who did this. Could be amateur, could be professional, not signed. Number 5. A very messy caption here. I mean, they should have done it against a dark background. It's 1914. And loose is written here. This is, it says something like train coming into Albuquerque. It could be loose, it could be Lucero. We don't know. I have no idea who did this. Number 6, and we're getting to the end here. This is the State Fair Parade in 1911. They were so excited about becoming a state in the beginning of the next year that they called this the State Fair Parade, although technically New Mexico was still a territory. But good clear captioning, no indication of who the photographer was. None at all. Here we have a band. Here we have some union group in their overalls. Group of nice white-dressed young ladies carrying the American flag, probably with 48 stars on it. And here, in the end, we have people dispersing after the parade. These views are looking east toward the Alvarado, which is down here. This view is looking west at the end of the parade as the cars go tooting down the street. And people are dispersing at the end of the parade, which leads us to the end. Dispersing at the end of the presentation.